This recording is the last part of the Gilded Age, which falls into period 6 of the AP US History course. Today we will be starting with the 1896 election, in which the populists will continue to run. So this is one of the most successful elections for the populists. They will not win, but they back a Democratic candidate named William Jennings Bryan. He will run against a Republican nominee towards William McKinley. Now, the fact that they're backing a Democratic candidate is showing you that the policies of the populists are becoming popular enough that the major parties, the Democrats and Republicans, are starting to use them. So William Jennings Bryan runs a strict populist platform as a Democrat based on his campaign for free silver. He wanted an easy money supply, as we've been talking about, so that inflation would happen and farm prices would go up. He will lose the campaign and the economy will improve, which kind of ends the populist movement, because if you remember from our last lecture, one of the things that made populism so popular was the economic downturn in the 1890s. That as that ends, people stop listening to the populists and they will go away until they return on a national level as the progressives. So William Jennings Bryan was a gifted speaker, lawyer, and he will run for president 3 times. He's also a devout Protestant. He makes his career in Nebraska politics, which is where he picks up a lot of his populist ideas, and he will serve in the House of Representatives. He was the guy who defended the small farmer and laborer, and he worked closely with the Populist Party, even though he will run for the president in 1896 as a Democrat. So Bryan gets the nickname of the Great Commoner because he's running for the common people, and he's very well known for the Cross of Gold speech, which we will take a look at. So this Cross of Gold speech, which he's very famous for, argued that the real businessmen were farmers and agricultural workers and miners and small-town merchants. They demonstrated that true American spirit of the pioneer spirit, that they were making it happen of their own hard work. This goes back to that Protestant work ethic from the Puritans. These workers were all but ignored by the government that served the interest of only big cities and large corporate enterprises. So he's tapping into that populist feeling of the poor and the commoner not being supported by the federal government when he feels that they need to be. So he says here that they tell us that the great cities are in favor of the gold standard. We reply that our great cities rest upon our broad and great prairies. So he's talking about the idea, the farmers are really the backbone of the American government and the American people. So he makes a religious argument here, and he says he's talking about the brow of labor, this crown of thorns. That the idea that comparing themselves to Christ himself wearing the cross of, the crown of thorns and the cross that he had to bear as he goes to be crucified. There, he's making an allegory to that they are being crushed and crucified on this cross of gold, which was where it gets its famous name from. So you can see this political cartoonist uses some of the imagery that he portrays to show that he is a farmer, he's a Midwesterner who's bearing this cross of gold, and if you notice they all have price tags on them, showing that he is not supporting this idea of big business. So William McKinley, the man who actually wins the election of 1896, is born in Ohio, so he's kind of a Midwesterner as well. He was actually serving in the Civil War. He starts as a private and then eventually succeeds to the rank of major. He will serve in Congress, and he was a supporter of those protective tariffs that were kind of a double-edged sword for the populists, that they were protected from other farm goods coming from the country, but those machines that they needed were made so expensive. And again, he supports the gold standard as a Republican, so the populists are not too happy with him. So you can see the cartoon here is showing that obviously a populist sentiment, that the Republican Party is built on corporate wealth, that the Democratic Party is built on saloons and jails, they're tied to corruption and immoral things, and the People's Party was the one who builds the churches and the schools, about bettering everyone. And you can see here we still have that political divide during sectionalism. Even though the Civil War is over, the South is going to be that solid South of mostly Democrat, where the Republicans are going to control the North and the West, and those populists in the Midwest are going to not necessarily have much say in this 1896 election. Even though a larger section of the country votes for the Democrats, the Republicans hold the big industrial and population centers like Pennsylvania, like New York and New Jersey. So we kind of put this bimetallism thing to rest in 1900 when McKinley, as president, creates or signs the Gold Standard Act, and it confirmed that the nation's commitment to the gold standard. So the conservative forces win out here, and populism does not win this battle. So when we look at this election, we ask, why did Bryan lose? And he focused a little bit too much on silver and was not able to build bridges to urban voters. So there's a lot of people in cities that probably would have supported a lot of other populist or democratic ideas, but because he focuses on silver and the cities are really controlled by gold, he doesn't get them. He's not able to form alliances with other groups to strengthen his populist democratic movement. And McKinley's campaign was highly funded and far better organized than Bryan's, which kind of shows you that the Republicans are still kind of in control here, just like after Lincoln. And this populist sentiment kind of falls apart when we look at really the organization factor. And as we see, why did populism start to decline? As the economy improves, it kind of improves for everyone, so a lot of the arguments about the gold versus silver go away. Small producing farmers fades away, and most of these farmers move into cities, so they're going to be supported so they're probably going to support the Republicans and the gold standard. Race divided the Populist Party, especially in the South. The Democrats, who supported most of the populist movement, would not support any sort of civil rights legislation, but there were some populists who would, and they're not able to break the existing party loyalties to Democrats or Republicans. That's the biggest problem for most third-party candidates ever. And then most of their agenda was co-opted by the Democratic Party, so a lot of people said, well, why vote for this new populist party when I can just vote for the Democratic Party that have basically the same ideas? And when we look at the populists, it's always good. One of the easiest ways to kind of remember this is if you've ever read the story or seen the movie of The Wizard of Oz, a book by Frank L. Baum. And this novel was reportedly to be a political allegory. A man named Henry Littlefield writes a thesis about comparing these stories, the story of populism and the story of The Wizard of Oz. And when you look at some of the characters, you can see where he's talking about. So he writes that Dorothy kind of represents the common man. That her silver shoes, because in the book her shoes were actually silver, in the movie they are changed to ruby red, it kind of represents the silver standard. The Scarecrow was the farmer, the Tin Man without a heart was the industrial worker, and the Scarecrow had no brains, showing that farmers were not being pushed towards education. And William Jennings Bryan is the Cowardly Lion. Although he pushes for populism, he joins the Democratic Party rather than sticking with the populists. And for some other characters, you can see, the Wicked Witch of the East representing bankers, and she had these minions that would go out and do their bidding, or large industrial workers. The Yellow Brick Road was the gold standard that led them to Oz, and the great and powerful Oz was this guy William McKinley, who didn't really have all the power, but was kind of perceived to be, and that's what this guy Henry Littlefield argues in his thesis. So you start to see a few wins for the regulation of big business where that populists did want, and these are in two major court cases. So in Munn versus Illinois, the Supreme Court decided that that states had the ability to regulate private property if it affected public interest. So this mainly deals with things like the railroads, etc. And it's a step towards kind of breaking up these monopolies. And finally, the Wabash case was known that it was declared it was unconstitutional for states to regulate interstate commerce because that is a federal government thing, as we've seen in previous court cases. And it showed the need for federal regulation in interstate commerce. And the whole point of that is when the federal government starts to regulate this, we'll see that it's kind of a win for the populace and a win for anybody who's anti-monopolistic. So this concludes our discussion of period 6. You should be watching these and completing the questions in addition to the crash course videos and any of your chapter workbooks and note cards. And you should be preparing to write that DBQ on period 6.